So now I would like to introduce our speaker. Joelle Murchison is the Vice President of Enterprise Diversity and Inclusion at Travelers. Prior to that, she led corporate recruiting and diversity at United Technologies Corporation. In addition, she has experience in the nonprofit sector and in higher education. Joelle not only has her bachelor's from Brown in public policy and educational studies, but she also has a master's in education from Harvard and a master's in communication management from Syracuse University. Plus, in her free time, she hosts an internet radio show, so I am quite sure that Joelle is very busy, and I really appreciate her taking some time to be with us today to discuss this new imperative skill of cultural competency. Joelle, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me today, Heather. And welcome to all of you who have joined us today on this webinar on this very important topic. What you're seeing now is the standard disclaimer, which I will not read, and is not quite as long as the notes that our finance people read before we present. So I'm happy about that. Today's objectives, hopefully, are pretty basic, and we hope are ones that answer the questions that we might have piqued your interest with via the marketing around this particular webinar. And we really hope to accomplish three primary things. First, to explore the new and evolving landscape as it relates to diversity and inclusion. Secondly, to develop an understanding of the meaning of cultural competency. So you've probably heard that term in the past, and I'm going to hopefully debunk any of the myths around it and help you to understand how that plays into both your role as a job seeker as well as if you are in your own workforce and actively engaged. And then our final objective today is really to understand what this all means for you. We've all heard for probably the last decade or more that our landscape, our world, our globe is changing. We've heard about shifting demographics. And so today we hope to talk a little bit about what that means for you as a Brown alum, as a job seeker, or as an employee. So the way we're going to start this is to show you a video that hopefully will sort of encapsulate just one portion, quite frankly, of the changing landscape here in America. So with that, So I hope you all had a chance to see the video. The sound is only music, as Heather shared with you, but I think it helps to kind of demonstrate how fast-paced the change is here in the U.S. And the video shared with us a really interesting point. Now, we all have been hearing about the Hispanic population growth for, I would have to say, over a decade. I mean, initially there were points in time where we heard that the Hispanic population would become the majority in the United States initially by 2050. And then the projections were changed to 2032. And I'm confident that they will change, if they have not already, again. And so I wanted to share that as one way to demonstrate how fast our world is changing, and certainly how fast the U.S. is changing. But looking at this next slide, this, I hope, shares with you also some other critical points that impact some of the other groups that make up the demographics of the United States. So as you can see here, the Asian population is also not only having a significant impact, but is one of the fastest growing ethnic groups. While not as large in volume, certainly fastest growing. Women, as many of us already know, have made a significant impact on the economy, but certainly in terms of preparation for the workforce, women have been earning more bachelor's degrees than men since 1982. And more master's degrees since 1981. So some folks like to say, well, then how come there are less than 4% of women who are CEOs of Fortune 500 companies? It's one of those questions that we think about from a talent perspective, because it begs the question of whether or not women are truly effectively being utilized in the U.S. economy. The LGBT community, as you likely are aware, has become much more visible in the U.S. population, and their spending power is growing and growing as well, in addition to some of the legislative and policy implications that have changed the face of the United States. And finally, I just wanted to make one brief comment around minority-owned business. It's really important as we talk about this whole general changing demographic. When you think about the economic downturn and what that meant, we all often think most often about unemployment and how the unemployment numbers have increased significantly. The fact of the matter is, in spite of that, women and minority-owned businesses have significantly grown during this time frame. And the case is that many of those businesses are small businesses and may cater to particular segments of a population, very community-based, et cetera, lots of consultants in particular as well. But it is very much a force in the business community that is growing much more quickly than we ever anticipated. So what does this mean? We keep anticipating change. We're talking about change. Well, I would argue that the change is already here. If you look at some of the statistics in the video that we just saw, 56% of the U.S. population growth has been Hispanic. We look at some of the pop culture things that were shared. So tortillas outsell bread. All those kinds of things that we may not even realize have significant impact. I know in some of our grocery stores we see different foods from a variety of different cultures now have become really commonplace and are no longer, in many instances, relegated to a particular aisle within a grocery store. They have become a part of the fabric of who we are as a country. And so when we look at the change, it certainly started, political affiliation or not, with the fact that an African American has been elected U.S. president, well, elected and then reelected twice. That is something that I certainly and many, many others would concur that they never expected to see within our lifetime. So that's one indication. Secondly, as we talk about 4 generations in the workplace, we often hear about the mature generation, those who are above 60. We talk about the baby boomers. We talk about Generation X, a much smaller generation, as well as we hear a lot about the millennials. But the reality of the millennials is that because they have come up in such a technologically advanced reality, they are the ones who are experienced. They have access to technology, access to knowledge in ways that many of the other generations do not. To be a minority is a majority. I already mentioned the fact that the projections suggest that Hispanics would be the majority in the country in short order, but there are many, many cities across the United States and states, Los Angeles being one of them, some of the cities in Texas that are already majority, what we would have considered minority. And so some of our language is going to have to change as well. To be a woman is to be rising in opportunities. While we still have significant underrepresentation of women, particularly in corporate America in C-suite or CEO level roles, we are continuing to see more and more women beginning to crack that proverbial ceiling, if you will. To be disabled is to be differently abled. The disability community has really begun to reinvent itself, to acknowledge the fact that simply having a different ability does not signify that they are unable to contribute. And that's a very, very important piece, particularly as we think about our veterans and individuals who are coming back from the war and who are able to contribute to our society maybe differently than they did prior to going off to battle. And then finally, as I mentioned earlier, to be out is in. There's lots more appetite, conversation around the LGBT community, really in a very strong way, and so more to come there. So when we think about how diversity and yes, I'm so sorry.
As you were talking, I was thinking that a lot of people in the audience have probably seen some biggest changes, and I was wanting to throw it out to them to see if they could share with us, bring some of their feedback to what they're seeing out there in the cultures. And I also was wondering if you were seeing any geographic differences in cultural shifts within the U.S. So while the audience is taking a moment to think about that, I'm wondering if you could answer that question.
Sure, and thank you, Heather, for interjecting there. And we also would like to encourage any of you to utilize the chat function as well to share thoughts and commentary with us throughout the webinar. But certainly in terms of geography, I think that there have always been different cultural groups that have migrated to different geographic places within the United States. And we're already beginning to see in certain segments of the country, as I mentioned, in Texas and in California, many, many cities where the majority is already what we would have considered the minority. And so I think that depending upon where you sit in the United States, you may already have embraced this change much more quickly than in other places. I think in the Northeast in particular, there are cultural groups that have been a part of the fabric for generations, whereas we look at the Southeast in particular, Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, who have very new populations of Hispanic Latinos, which is very different for traditional, quote-unquote, Southern values. And so we're starting to have to learn to interact with one another in a very different way than we have in the past. Outside of the U.S. as well, Heather, I know I think that's something certainly as we look at our alumni base that's really important as well. We've been doing work in the UK and Canada, in Brazil, and certainly diversity and even the definition is very different in those countries. And so we look at some trends, particularly around different cultural groups, and in the UK in particular, even more so around religion than race or ethnicity. We're starting to see some necessary changes as it relates to those different groups. So lots of change, not just here in the U.S., but certainly across the world.
One of the participants says that in the nonprofit where they work, the sixth president is actually the first Hispanic in the organization's 134th history. So that's a great.
That's incredible.
A couple of people have also said, younger bosses, changing in just the work dynamics and, the way people are interacting.
Absolutely, absolutely. And we'll talk a little bit about that as we sort of look at the workplace segment, but technology has had a tremendous impact on the way that we interact. And on the earlier slide, when we talked about to be young is to be experienced, because of the access to information and knowledge that our population has gained much younger than in the past, I think there's a real opportunity to leverage the strengths of of younger individuals as leaders. So it's been really, this is just the beginning, as I see it, a real tipping point for our culture as we move forward. So speaking of that very point, just wanted to take a quick moment to take a look back as we move forward that, years ago in the 70s and 80s when we talked about differences and cultural shifts, it was primarily around affirmative action and individuals seeking to be acknowledged, to be made a part of organizations. We focused on tolerating difference as opposed to now where I think we look at diversity and inclusion. So diversity being the mix, as one of my colleagues likes to say, and inclusion being what you do with the mix. So not simply about bean counting, let's count how many folks are here, let's ensure that there are quotas to make sure that there are representative members of each population. But now that we've given access, what can we do? What can we leverage? How can we benefit from including all of the different individuals in the course of the work that we do? And so moving towards appreciation, appreciating the differences of all of the individuals who are part of your organization and how they can bring to bear the different experiences that they've had. And so it's akin to moving from using a rotary phone to using a smartphone in terms of the light speed with which our society has moved. We used to have to be stable to talk on the phone to make our connections, and now we can connect from literally anywhere, and that changes the game significantly in terms of what we have at our fingertips and also what's expected of us. So the so what of all of this, I'm sure many of you are thinking, wanted to give you a grounding initially in what's going on in the landscape, but why is this important? As the slide reads, really understanding an individual's cultural background really helps you to understand their behavior. And by default, whether you're thinking about employees, so many of yourselves, or job seekers, it's essential for businesses to understand that there are, in fact, very different ways of interacting within the workplace. And as any of us, we think about the experiences and the background that we've had that shaped who we are today. In many instances, the cultural realities help to shape who we are, and in particular, what we're able to bring to bear in our businesses. So understanding that reality and realizing that there are different skill sets and experiences that people bring to work every day is really what cultural intelligence is about. So for you as an employee or as a leader or manager, being culturally intelligent is important. So what does that mean? Well, as we talked about, business is conducted all across the world, and technology allows people to be connected effortlessly, which essentially says that for you to understand the differences in culture is critical to attracting people to your products and services. So I'll give one example. As we've transitioned into working in Latin America, we've had to adapt, and so this is the case study on Traveler's Partner. I'm going to talk a little bit about our company, but I think this is a good way to transition into it. We've had to adapt a bit in terms of some of our typical business practices. So we had to learn prior to going to Brazil what some of the expectations were in a business meeting. We operate from a very, and not just we travelers, but we as citizens of the United States operate in a very Eurocentric, Western, if you will, notion of conducting business. We expect people to look us right in the eye. We expect meetings to start right on time and to end right on time. We do not expect people to be eating during meetings, for example. And many of these things, or during really formal strategic meetings, and many of those things, whether in Brazil or other countries outside of the U.S., are very different. And so we had to make sure that we became culturally intelligent about the population that we were walking into, so as not to offend, but also to be able to embrace so that we could move together in partnership. So this is why I wanted to talk a little bit about the business world and why cultural intelligence and ultimately cultural competence is so important to companies. And then, as I mentioned earlier, we'll wrap up with why it's important to you. So just a tiny bit about Travelers. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the company, particularly our iconic red umbrella. You've probably seen the commercials with our dog. Chopper is his name, actually, for any of you who are pop culture fans. And we are essentially an insurance company, the largest provider of property casualty insurance, so auto, home, business, that sort of thing, not life insurance, not health insurance. We have about 30,000 employees, and as I mentioned, primarily in the United States, but we are doing more business in the UK, Ireland, Canada, and Brazil. And so that was one of the reasons for us that being much more broad around diversity was critically important. So about 6 years ago when I joined the company, what we had in front of us was really sort of a tipping point. The organization had just merged, and we recognized that there was a great opportunity for us to take some stock of who was in the organization and how we could begin to move the company forward in a very inclusive way that would connect to our ability to be successful as a business. As you know, most businesses exist so that they can be profitable and so that they can, particularly if you are a publicly traded company, so that you can respond to your shareholders and be a good corporate citizen. And so for us, one of those realities was understanding the diversity that we already had, so the mix, but also leveraging that mix to figure out how we could help all of our employees help the company to be more successful, to be able to anticipate the needs of our customers and to anticipate maybe even some of our product needs as we move to the future. So how did we translate that to the workforce? What did that mean? Well, it meant for us that we needed to be much more clear foundationally about what we meant about diversity. Was it simply window dressing? Did we just want to have representative folks across the place that suggested that, yes, we did have diverse people and women working here? No, that's what we decided was not what we wanted. But we wanted this employee base to understand that it's important to respect and appreciate one another for our differences, to acknowledge the fact that business was not always going to be business as usual. We are a very traditional company who have done things a traditional way for a very long time and been relatively successful. And so what was the impetus for us to change? Simply looking around us and the awareness of who we had in our employee base and what our customers were demanding. And so we launched some programs initially that would help us to educate our employee base, but also to involve them. So Diversity Speak we used as an opportunity to help our executives and our broader employee base understand diversity. And then we used our diversity networks, which some of you I'm sure are familiar with, to help leverage the power and experience of our employees so that they might be able to bring some of their cultural know-how and experience and knowledge to the table for the advancement of both our own individual professional development, but the company more broadly. So our education program was critical in that. We rolled out a training to over 30,000 employees that helped them to understand what diversity meant, and ultimately, were they making judgments about coworkers and customers based on their own experiences and biases and lack of cultural intelligence that would impact our ability to do business? Finally, from a productivity perspective, were our employees bringing their whole selves to work in order to support the workplace for others to do the same? So does that mean that if we were gay, were we free to be out in front of our fellow employees, in front of our team? Or did we feel like we had to hide who we were? Did we check our own individual personalities? Did I check Joelle, the African-American mom at the door, in order to work here? And what we recognize is that, no, we want people to bring everyone and everything that they are to bear in the workplace, because we think that ultimately creates an environment where we can all be more productive. So overall, it's important for organizations to really take stock of who's in the organization and how best to leverage not only for company success but individual success. As we talk about that, it brings to bear some things that are important for you as you think about your role in your company or if you're seeking a position. In the frame of cultural intelligence and cultural competence and communication and really leveraging leadership, building relationships is really central. in helping us all to become more culturally intelligent and to demonstrate that dexterity within those relationships, to demonstrate some courage to ask questions, to learn more, and then finally to communicate what you've learned so that you can be more intelligent about the decisions that need to be made and who you can leverage on your team for the greater success of the organization. So cultural competence ultimately is your ability to interact, to do all of those things, to build the relationships, to have communication, the ability to ask questions, and to take what you've learned to help you partner and interact with people of all different cultures and all different backgrounds. Many of us suffer from what I like to call similarity bias. We're most comfortable being around people who look like us, who act like us, who might be from places where we are. Maybe we like to be around all Brown alums. Wouldn't that be wonderful sometimes? But the reality of the situation is that it's helpful for us to be with people who are somewhat different, who can bring some different skill sets to the table. And that's really what cultural competence is about. Understanding your own worldview, building an attitude towards cultural differences, so not in a way that you simply tolerate or that you're aware of differences but you don't learn to understand them. The attitude really is important about really appreciating the differences and whether or not you embrace them as your own, acknowledging that people's differences do have a right to exist, that they do have a place in their reality. The third component of cultural competence is really knowledge of different cultural practices. So how do you push yourself to learn more about other cultures around the world? As I mentioned, when we went to Brazil, we had to spend some dedicated time learning about the way business is transacted in Brazil so that we could be respectful of the culture when we arrived there. And then finally, those cross-cultural skills. So once you've learned about people and developed a great attitude towards difference and understand clearly who you are, how do you use those skills to interact and to build relationships with folks across cultures? One
Joelle,
really kind of cool.
Yes,
I was going to say, Heather, I know you wanted to share an example as well.
I could hear your hesitations there. I was wondering if you could back up for just a minute to the programs that you did, the 3 across, because as it talks about sort of going from, okay, what does the culture have, and then what is for my company, and then how does that sort of relate to me for cultural competency. I'm wondering if you had any outcomes from some of your programs about evaluating your cultural biases and communication styles.
Sure, absolutely. I mean, I'll share, there are a couple of things that are specific to travelers and then some others that I would share kind of more broadly. First, quickly, one of the things that we learned in launching the 30,000 employee diversity education program is that many people expected the conversation to be exactly as I described on an earlier slide. So this affirmative action, let's get one black person, one gay person, someone in a wheelchair, and a Native American all in a room to hold hands and sing Kumbaya. And that was the kind of thing that people fully expected from diversity training. I love to tell people this is not your grandfather's diversity training. We've got some work to do about what we think, what our own biases are. And so overwhelmingly the responses that we heard from the training are whether it was not at all what they expected. And they learned much more not only about others but about themselves that hindered them from being more culturally competent. And so what we then did was provide opportunities for our employees to take advantage of different programs that they could view on the internet, on our company's intranet, on their own to continue their learning. So that session was not the be-all, end-all, but really just an opening and opportunity. Lots of companies from their programs, whether it be a training program or their employee network groups, have seen lots of incredible outcomes. In fact, some of the consumer packaged goods companies have seen new opportunities for product development. For example, a colleague of mine who was with Frito-Lay talked with great passion about the Hispanic Latino employee group at Frito-Lay at the time, which is a company that produces Doritos, as you may be familiar. And their test marketing of a new Dorito flavor that initially sort of fell flat, but because of the involvement of that group, they were able to help the company develop yet another flavor that would be more well-received within the community. And so it's those kinds of examples. That's a pretty specific one. But in many, many instances, I mean, literally from employees who have a particular language skill being able to help their company translate into a new language. Here at Travelers, we have a Spanish-speaking sales center for the first time. We piloted 2 years ago with lots of support from our Hispanic Latino diversity network to allow our agents to sell Travelers, but in the language that many of the potential consumers speak and felt more comfortable. So lots and lots of different outcomes. Diversity Inc. simply just published their top 50 just a couple of days ago, top 50 companies in diversity. And they started treating the Diversity Inc. top 50 as a stock index. And if you look at the performance of those companies who are committed to diversity and have a number of different elements that suggest that commitment, whether it be recruitment, retention, product development, et cetera, those companies as a stock index outperform the Dow and the S&P 500. So what that ultimately tells you is that companies who are committed to diversity, so the so what for the companies is it means not only that we can anticipate the needs of our customers, but being committed to diversity and leveraging the experiences of your employee base leads to a much more productive, innovative, and creative workforce. And it's those companies that are best suited to compete in this marketplace. And certainly with that competition is some success that you can see generated through their financial performance. And so that's really sort of from a bottom line perspective, one of the real tangible outcomes of a commitment and a focus and embracing of diversity.
And then what was really nice about your program as well is then how you took the personal aspect. And I just wanted to point out, too, that that's part of, there's lots of ways to get information from this workshop. And for those who are actually a job seeker, that importance of being able to evaluate the culture of a company and how it fits your personal style, and is this a place where you can bring your whole self to work, is a way to take that to the next level.
Absolutely, absolutely. So, and I think, we want to talk a little bit about that. Let me jump back up to where I was, and we can even move forward, because I think that the piece of it for you as a potential job seeker, as you think about organizations that you might want to work for, what we're learning, particularly around the new generations in the workplace, lots of folks place the emphasis on the millennials here, but I would argue as a Gen Xer that these values are important to me as well. And it's what is the company committed to? What are the company's values? What do they hold as important? And what we hear a lot with the millennials is that companies who are committed to giving back to the community, very important to them. Companies who are committed to diversity, who are actively working to be much more inclusive and provide equal access to opportunity within their organization, critically important as a value. And so there's a real connector, if you will, between why companies are committing to and really exploring diversity and inclusion, and ultimately the success of their workforce and in attracting really talented people to work for them. So as I was mentioning around the whole cultural impact piece and us going to Brazil and sort of having to understand and recognize the importance of cultural differences and cultural norms, just a really simple example. So I mentioned before, that we tend to be very Western-centric, very Eurocentric. So imagine that in a boardroom, in a conference room, you've got two people, one who would live by the Western proverb that a squeaky wheel gets the oil. And so they're raising their hand, they're speaking up, they're talking, probably have talked a little bit more than average in the conversation. And then juxtapose it with across the table, you've got someone who lives by and ascribes to a Japanese proverb, the nail that stands out gets hammered down. Maybe a little less likely to speak up, a little hesitant to raise their hand, maybe kind of keeping some of their ideas and their concepts for a later conversation, the meeting after the meeting, if you will. Now, think about the kinds of assumptions that can be made incorrectly in this meeting. So the westernized, quote-unquote, person is thinking, gosh, will that person ever speak up? They're not even paying attention. They're so disconnected and checked out. Meanwhile, the Japanese proverb person is thinking, gosh, are they ever going to stop talking? Will they give anyone else a chance to speak? Sometimes it's not always about being the loudest, but being the most impactful. So think about how if you've been raised by one or the other of these proverbs, how different your reality is within the context of that conversation, how different your reality is within the context of an organization. And that's really the importance of taking a look at cultural competency within an organization. Too often, organizations make decisions based upon those two proverbs, those two experiences, one being more dominant than the other, and only finding that the one that's dominant is the one that is best suited for people in the organization. And that may not altogether be true. So the importance of understanding that there are people coming from different backgrounds, and that as managers, as leaders, it's critically important for us to include all different perspectives and even draw out some individuals who may not typically, as a course of who they are, be the ones to jump up and raise their hand, is important to really getting to some good solutions and some great answers that the company may have never thought of previously. So just to wrap up, wanted to just share two concepts around cross-cultural competence and things that you can do specifically as an employee within the organization. It's really important for you, as we alluded to earlier, to understand culture for yourself. Understand who you are. What do you bring to the table? What are some of the things that you most value? And this time, instead of thinking about yours being the best, think about how you might be biased, what stereotypes you might hold around different styles and behaviors. So owning your own cultural realities, but then acknowledging that some of them may be biased. Well, just because you've always done it this way doesn't always mean that it's the only way to do it. So really acknowledging your biases and understanding, beginning to reach out and understand other differences. The next two stages, I think, are really more for leaders in the organization, what we'd expect your managers and supervisors, or if you are the leaders, to be doing, to incorporate diverse perspectives. So to call on that person that maybe is not always raising their hand, to ask someone who may not be your go-to person from a similarity bias perspective to participate. Ask them to run with a program or a task that has to be done, and allow them the opportunity to demonstrate their capability to do so. And in doing that, you as a leader really build a cross-culturally competent organization, because what you've demonstrated is that you can reach out to folks and allow them to express themselves in different ways, which ultimately optimizes all of the views and the creativity and innovation that you might see. So just to wrap up, I think these last couple of points really encapsulate what I would consider a culturally competent leader. Doesn't have to be business leader. If you're in the nonprofit sector, business, academia, on campus, I think to be culturally competent, these are some of the things that you've got to do. You have to value and promote diversity and inclusion. Understand it for yourself. Make a point of learning about others. Act as a role model and lead the way. Help others on your team to understand how important it is. Clearly understand the business, whatever the work is that you do, and what its customers may need, because it may be those things that lead you to having to do a little bit more introspection around your own cultural competence. And anticipate the changing landscape. So as we did 2 decades ago, talking about the expected Hispanic Latino population growth, our companies certainly responded to that. Building and leveraging a diverse team, really allowing for people who have a variety of viewpoints and opinions, and then finally demonstrating adaptability, using your cultural intelligence and cross-cultural competency to your advantage. So those are just some things that I would share with you. I think in terms of, what the landscape is, why it's important to some companies in particular, in my own experience, and then finally how you can be prepared for competing within that landscape and advancing your organization or seeking an opportunity in an organization that is focused in that direction. And we'd love to take any questions at this point.
Joelle, that's a lot of great information, and there are some great questions coming in.
Excellent.
And it's giving a lot of food for thought. I'm wondering if we can back up just to the one slide, because there's several questions sort of about that in the synopsis there. One of the things is about helping people increase their adaptability. I lived in Sweden for 5 years, and what was so astounding was the way that I had to question things in my life that I had never thought to question, like parenting rules that were completely different, and the way in the workforce in Sweden everybody has coffee at 10 o'clock, and that's what you do, and you stop what you're doing because that community in the workforce was very important to them. I had never really drank coffee before then, and now I definitely drink 2 to 3 cups a day. So how does a person, increase their adaptability, set up maybe some situations to help them learn when they're not able to go to Brazil or Sweden, in their own workforce?
Sure. I have a perfect example of that probably hits very close to home. When I was at Brown, coming from a pretty traditional African-American family growing up in New York, when I got to Brown, of course, in and around Brown, even at that point, so, 20 years ago, lots of different foods and cultures that I had never been introduced to. And, often on campus there was Indian food that was shared, and something about a first experience that I had made me not open to really trying it. So fast forward 20 years or so. Last fall, one of my colleagues who literally worked right on my floor offered me the opportunity to connect. We chatted. She wanted to learn some more about some of our diversity networks, share her experience coming directly from India, and we sat and talked. And I decided to share with her what I thought was my Achilles heel as a diversity practitioner, that I would constantly say to people when they say, oh, let's go to lunch, and I would say anywhere but Indian. Now, I'm supposed to be a diversity practitioner, so that's just unacceptable. So I shared with her my challenge. I made myself vulnerable, and I admitted to her that I really did have, sort of an aversion for no reason, for no good reason. And so she was good enough to say, let's go to lunch. We went to lunch at an Indian restaurant here in downtown Hartford, and she very carefully and delicately explained everything to me. And we went on a journey through India, from northern to southern, around all of the different foods and the origin of the foods and why some of the foods were, the ingredients were used as they were, and what things that I would like more than others. And she took that time to do that. And I think, Heather, your experience demonstrates that as well. I mean, everyone can't be transplanted into a new environment, but we certainly can role model and put ourselves into situations where we are able to learn and to grow from some of the experiences that we have every day that we may not leverage. So that's just a really basic, common example. Obviously, there are lots of books and research and things like that you can do, but I think some of it is around the relationships, building a comfortable enough relationship where there's some trust, being willing to ask questions in an appropriate way, but getting with some people who will answer you and will help you in your own cultural growth, your cultural intelligence. We all have biases. I think that's the most important thing for us to remember. And so there's something for all of us that we can learn.
That is a great story. I love that story. And overcoming food hesitancies has definitely been a challenge for me that I learned by just trying to travel and put myself out there with different people. And it's generating lots of great questions, too. A few things about helping the individual and then maybe helping the individual talk to their company about avoiding stereotypes. And, helping people that sort of struggle with what seems like traditions and moving away from that. Do you have any tips?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest mistakes that we make is making the assumption that a company does a particular thing specifically because they know that a group of people don't like it. I think that's the assumption that we make, and so we may be hesitant to ask a question or to query why a particular process or language is used. So I think a lot of times what we have to do, this is the part where we become cultural interpreters. That's a term that's used typically when folks from the U.S. are going to another country as expats, and you're the cultural interpreter, or you need a cultural interpreter, someone to help you walk through that culture. Well, I would advance that that's the case in every organization that we work in. We need someone to help us navigate the culture. And part of that is saying, hey, this practice, I'm curious, how did we begin using that? Or why did we choose to use this photo or this image to represent what have you? I mean, we have a number of examples here where one of our customers brought to our attention a particular image that was used in one of our brochures. This was years ago, that we, too, had to learn. It was very generational. It had some really negative connotations for this particular person that we realized no matter how many people it had negative connotations for, as a company, we didn't want anyone to perceive our materials as negative. And so we changed it. But we would have never known if someone hadn't brought it to our attention. I mean, that's the important piece, is asking the question rather than making the assumption, and getting comfortable with that uncomfortability, because it's not always comfortable.
Yeah, that's a great point. And another good point that has come in that relates to some of the information you gave earlier is that a man saying, our company works with a very, very diverse population, but it's not feeling represented within the corporation. Are you seeing that as a trend? Is that something that is being addressed, that you hear that out in the industry?
I think typically companies are starting to realize that and beginning to pay a little bit more attention to diversity because of that. Because quite frankly, they may no longer enjoy the competitive advantage that they have in the marketplace if they do not stay, sort of ahead of the game in terms of what the population is requiring. And if you don't have individuals within the company who can understand and can relate to the experience of the customer, then typically you won't be able to anticipate well what the customer's new and future demands will be. So I think that's, quite frankly, probably one of the most significant reasons that organizations have begun to look more at diversity and inclusion, simply because of that. They won't be able to maintain their competitiveness if other competitors in their industry are paying more attention to the customer and do have a workforce that's representative of the customer. That only allows them to advance. So I think it's hopefully for your organization, for the person who asked it, that's something that is causing them to take some stock and ask some more questions, acknowledging, in fact, that there's a real opportunity for them there.
Another question came in about the Asian population increasing in universities, and yet that not being as easy for them now because of the economic situation to continue that into the workforce or to see the achievement. And you and I were talking about an article that had been in New York Magazine about Asians overachieving in school but lagging in the boardroom. I didn't know if you had any recommendations.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. In a prior role, I worked a great deal with recruiting students out of MBA programs to a previous employer. And one of the biggest challenges that we saw then was that many students had come to business school from other countries and had hoped that they would be able to retain employment here in the United States. The challenge is that often the sponsorship issue for international students is challenging. But I also think that there are some pretty deep cultural realities as well when we talk about, even Asian Americans in particular, and navigating the corporate landscape. So to your point about the boardroom piece, I think it goes back to the example that I shared, quite frankly, that there are some cultural norms that are different. We hear oftentimes about eye contact, for example. Very westernized civilization, Euro-focused behavior suggests that when people talk to you, you should look them directly in the eye. So not only in some Asian cultures, but also in some African cultures, that is clearly disrespectful. you particularly don't look someone in the eye who you perceive to be more senior than you. And so how do we navigate that landscape? From a gender perspective, for example, in some cultures, it's not expected that a woman would be necessarily as aggressive as you need to be within corporate America. And so I think some people struggle with navigating, their cultural realities with the demands that are required of the workforce. And does that mean that I'm selling out, quote unquote, or does that mean that I am not effectively representing who I am? It brings to bear a lot of identity issues, a lot of cultural issues. Good companies are starting to be much better or much more aware of those kinds of issues and challenging their leaders to be more responsive, as I alluded to earlier. But I think that's a lot of it. I definitely think, when you talk about international populations, there's some challenges specifically because of the economic downturn and then some of the sponsorship issues. But I think for Asian Americans here within the U.S., I do think that there are still some cultural issues across the generations. And we as individuals, particularly who support diversity within organizations, have to make our companies be aware of that and help our leaders to learn to acknowledge that there are many, many different ways to demonstrate leadership. So I think it's still obviously an issue that needs a lot more work.
Other areas that need some work that you touched on a little bit, two questions that came in, and to me, my first gut was that these really relate to you as the individual finding a good cultural fit. So there's one person asking about dealing with recruiters who may lack cultural intelligence if you are from a minority group and don't seem to have a lot of interest in understanding your culture, and how do you overcome that? And then something similar, but when you're in, if a culturally insensitive thing is said and no one says anything, how do you help the employee deal with that?
Yes, I'll deal with the last one first in terms of responding to an insensitive comment. I mean, again, this is where you have to kind of get comfortable with the uncomfortable. And I've coached quite a number of employees over time around those kinds of situations. Again, we all have biases. We all come to the table with experiences. Now, our ability to learn from them varies widely across the individuals that you'll come into contact with throughout your life. So I think the challenge is you've got to get comfortable in a space where you're either going to not say anything and live with it, which I think ultimately diminishes your ability to be productive, or you're going to face it head on with some support and some coaching. I've sat with employees who wanted to kind of talk to a manager or a peer about how they felt about the way something was said. Again, I think we want to start with the assumption that there is positive intent and not that the person intended it to hit you that way. There are still quite a number of us in the United States who have not been exposed to lots of people from different cultures. I mean, let's face facts. We're still a very, very segregated country, no matter what our mix looks like. And so we do have to understand at some points that we've got some things to teach. I always share this story just really quickly. When I was in my freshman year at Brown, first year at Brown, I should say, because that's what we say, and my neighbor across the hall, I noticed was always sort of watching as I was going to the shower because I don't wash my hair every day. Now, I'm not going to say all African Americans don't wash their hair every day, but a good number of African American women do not wash their hair every day. And I watched her sort of uncomfortable, wanting to ask me, but not. And finally, we got to this really uncomfortable point where she asked the question. Now, I had two ways I could have responded. I could have either taken the task of, I'm so tired of educating people about who I am, which I think is a burden that's placed upon people who come from historically underrepresented groups. Or I could have told her why, and so that she would have been more informed. And I chose the latter because ultimately I felt like if I didn't do it, then she would either never ask a question again or she would continue on with misinformation or at least a lack of information. So I think sometimes we have to challenge ourselves to be willing to be the educator. I recognize that it is frustrating and that it is, maybe an undue burden, but it's still the reality of this country. So I think that's part of it. We've got to, roll our sleeves up and get engaged in this dialogue to really help each other grow as far as that's concerned. The other question, the first question, was, now I'm forgetting. I answered the one about the challenging conversations.
It was about when you're interviewing.
Yes, so interviewing. So I wish I could tell you that every recruiter you come into contact with is culturally competent, but we work with them too. So, I think in some instances, to Heather's earlier point, there's some cultural realities about the organization that unfortunately the recruiter either represents well or doesn't. And that might be an indicator to you as to whether or not that's a place that you want to be. But, we're all on a journey, I think, ultimately. We've all got a lot to learn. So, a mentor of mine once said, take every opportunity to provide feedback because you never know if someone will ever have a chance to tell them again. So that would be my advice to you.
One last question, and I think we might have to move on and respect people's time here, but I think we've had some great conversation. But it was a question that I had also wanted to bring up, too. Someone says, you said to be young is experience. What is the impact of that ideology trend on the older population? And, the generational issues are definitely another cultural
Absolutely.
topic. Do you have any last words on that?
Yeah, and just quickly, I think to that question's point, I think there are some folks in the organization who are more mature, quote unquote, and aren't interested in learning new things and new skill sets, and that absolutely is a barrier for them, since many of them have to be in the workforce longer than they anticipated, given the economic downturn. But I do think that there's a lot of value. We have an incredible employee who's been here for more than 40 years, actually quite a number. We have a very, very long tenured employee base here. And they are still folks that we seek out regularly whenever there are new ideas and new suggestions coming to bear. So I think it depends on how you position yourself. As a mature, long tenured person, you can add lots of value and be willing to learn and hear and also share, or you can kind of close yourself off. I think it's something that you have to kind of think about as you position yourself for the new realities.
Joelle, this has been fantastic. I really appreciate all the information that you've given us, and I know that our audience has. There's a few more questions that are coming in that I will share with you, and we will try and at least touch things as we can. You had made some recommendations of some good resources, good books out there that I want to be sure and share with everybody. Do you have anything you want to comment about any of these?
Yeah, I would say, they're very different, each of them. A Chance in the World is a biography by one of my colleagues. He's the head of diversity at Walgreens, an incredible story. So that's sort of a real story of diversity. Expect to Win is really a career development book, incredibly empowering. The Inclusion Paradox, if any of you are in a company and looking to transform your company around diversity, that is what I would consider the Bible. The Power of Choice really is an individual, sort of how do you learn your cultural reality and use it to drive your career, a great career, along with Expect to Win. And then, of course, Lean In is new, and I have not read it yet, but some of what I've heard I think is really inspirational for women. So certainly another book on the topic that I think is a very valuable one.
Oh, great. You're just expanding my reading list for sure. Thank you to everyone for joining us today. The Brown Alumni Relations Career Services offers some tools for you. This is one of them. If you are interested in doing any sort of career development, check out our website, check out some of the resources we have to offer. I can't thank you enough, Joelle, for being with us today. She has kindly given her email address if anyone has some real diversity issues to coordinate with her. That would be great. If you need to contact any of us, please feel free to do that. You can follow us on Twitter or Facebook with career issues, job postings, insights. Thank you all for joining us today. Thank you so much, Joelle. Do you have any final comments?
Just thank you so much for the opportunity, and folks, continue on your journeys. I wish you all the best.